Welcome to another episode of Transparent Physics. In this episode, we're going to wrap up the demo involving the egg in the bottle with an explanation about the physics behind how that works. And there's no way that we can explain what happened to the egg without understanding the idea of pressure. Pressure is related to the idea of force. If you're anywhere into your introductory physics studies, I'm sure you've been exposed to the idea of a force before, either a push or a pull. Pressure expands that idea and considers not just the amount of force that's acting on an object, but the area over which that force is exerted. And the calculation is pressure is equal to force divided by area. So you can get a high pressure by getting a large force. For example, if you're sat on by an elephant, let's say, that would be a large amount of force and would cause a large amount of pressure on you. But it also can go the other way. Sometimes a high pressure might be due more to the fact that there's a small area. So for example, if somebody's standing in high heels and they step on your hand with the pointy heel, your hand's going to experience a lot of pressure there as well. Very different sort of set of circumstances, but when you take force divided by area, there's different ways that we can end up with a high pressure. Simplifying what can be a very complicated set of phenomenon. Basically, for the intent of this demonstration, we just have to consider the fact that whenever there is a difference in pressure, the higher pressure is going to push towards the lower pressure. And if there happens to be an object between the higher pressure and the lower pressure, that object is also going to be pushed towards the lower pressure. And this relationship can be seen in a huge variety of phenomenon. Barometers work this way, aerosol spray cans work this way, sealed jelly jars, drinking straws. A wide variety of circumstances have this phenomenon in play. Narrowing our focus to air pressure specifically, first of all, air is a mixture of elements and molecules flying around. You may remember your states of matter: solid, liquid, gas. That's not all the states of matter, but that's a good start for now. And gas particles move around very quickly. They tend to fill the container, take the shape of the container, and there can be space between the particles as they bounce off each other and just fly around, bounce off the surfaces of the container that they're in. And every time a particle bumps into another particle, there has to be a force in order to change the motion. The physics is the same on the molecular level as it would be on the regular person scale. And all of these interactions can result in the phenomenon of air pressure. And what that means is that you are, when you're sitting around in the atmosphere, there are millions and millions of molecules hitting against your skin, exerting force on your skin. And that's pressure. You've got a force acting over an area, and that combination is what we know as air pressure. All right, that was a lot of different important phenomena sort of wrapped up in a pretty tight package there. Let's try to apply some of that in the context of the egg demonstration. We'll go step by step, see what happened. And it's impossible to explain what happened to the egg without relying on the principles of pressure. Okay, the scene is set. Here's the empty flask, and we're going to be talking about the air inside the flask. That's really going to be our focus point. And to start with, really, there's not much to say about the air inside the flask. The air inside the flask is the same as the air outside the flask. So when I say normal, I mean that the air outside the flask is moving around, bouncing randomly, hitting off stuff, getting redirected. And the air inside the flask is doing the exact same thing, moving at the same rate, bouncing off stuff, exerting pressure. The amount of pressure exerted on the inside of the flask wall is the same as the amount of pressure exerted on the outside of the flask wall. There really is no difference between the air on the outside and the air on the inside. So there's really not much to say right now. We'll look at it as things change, as the experiment continues. And as a result of that, the pressure inside the flask is equal to the pressure outside the flask, and we call the pressure outside the flask atmospheric pressure because that's the pressure that the atmosphere is exerting. Okay, then we drop the fuel source into the flask. The flames heat the air inside the flask, indicated by the red graphics. And anything that's heated up, the particles are going to move faster. If air is heated up, the particles speed up. They exert more force off each other. They also spread out from each other. So if the volume of the gas inside the flask has increased, but the volume of the flask doesn't increase as well, that means you can't fit as much air in the flask anymore. So some of the air is going to leave the flask, as indicated by the little wispy symbol above it. And when we put all that together and look at the air inside the flask, a couple important things have happened. Some of the mass has left the flask, so the mass of air inside the flask is less. Now, the particles are moving faster, but let's just make the argument, because there's fewer particles, there's going to be fewer impacts. Since the temperature is higher and the particles are moving faster, they're going to impact with more force. And that creates sort of a balancing act between the air inside the flask and outside the flask. And imagine like you're at a concert and there's a mosh pit sort of in front of the stage, and the rest of the crowd is sort of trying to push it on the mosh pit, but the mosh pit's just like jamming and they're pushing everybody else back. Let's say that, I don't know, 20% of the mosh pit gets pulled out by security or something like that. So there's fewer people now in the mosh pit, so you would think the mosh pit would have to shrink because the rest of the crowd is going to push in on them. But right at that moment, the band kicks into like a super crazy aggressive number, and the people in the mosh pit just like are on fire. They're like, "Roar!" And they're like dancing with more force, and they're bouncing off each other even harder. So even though there's fewer people in the mosh pit, maybe they're moving so much more aggressively that they can still push the crowd back. So fewer particles exerting more force can still balance things out, if we want to think of it that way. And from the flask perspective, the pressure inside the flask is still equal to the pressure outside the flask, even though the conditions are very different. And we just have to look at it in terms of the top, in terms of the fact that the top of the flask is open. If there were ever going to be a point where the atmospheric pressure was less than the pressure inside the flask, then more air is going to leave the flask. As we talked about, everything always moves to a lower pressure. So this is kind of a self-regulating system. The flask, fewer and fewer particles, but they're moving faster, but we still have the same pressure on the inside as on the outside. Next up, let's look at the instant that we cap the flask with the egg. At that exact moment, nothing really has appreciably changed. Inside the flask, again, obviously there's still fewer particles, and associated with that, fewer impacts, but the instant it's capped, the temperature in the flask is still higher, and the particles inside the flask are still exerting more force. They're punching above their weight, if we want to think about it that way. And since nothing's changed yet, the pressure inside the flask is still the same as the pressure outside the flask. And now it's not going to remain that way for long, but the instant we cap it, the pressures are still the same inside and out. So when we watch the demonstration, the egg doesn't get pulled into the flask immediately. When we cap it, there's sort of a moment or two before the egg goes into the flask. But if we watch, when we cap the flask, the fire goes out almost immediately. And when that fire goes out, it sets everything else into motion. The fire goes out because there's no more oxygen to feed it. And with the fire out and the container sealed, the amount of air inside the flask is fixed. But the temperature of that air begins to drop as the heat flows out of the flask into the environment. With the temperature decreasing, the speed of the particles' movement is also decreasing as well. And as the particles start to move more slowly, we see that they begin to impact with less force. And as the force decreases, force is part of pressure. And if the area remains the same, but the amount of force begins to decrease, then the pressure begins to decrease as well. So what happens is the pressure on the egg from the inside of the flask actually gets smaller, while the pressure on the outside remains the same. And as a result, when the pressure on the inside of the flask is less than the pressure on the outside of the flask, we see that the egg begins to be pushed into the flask. The egg isn't sucked into the flask. The egg is actually being pushed into the flask because the air pressure on the outside is more than the air pressure on the inside. Because if we want to go back to our mosh pit metaphor, there's fewer people in the mosh pit, but now they're beginning to run out of a little bit of steam, and the rest of the crowd is beginning to sort of crush in on them, and they don't have as much energy to push back on the encroaching crowd. And as we continue to watch the demonstration, this trend just continues. Our mosh pit of air inside the flask is getting weaker and weaker because the temperature continues to decrease. So there's fewer particles inside the flask compared to what there used to be. So they are losing the burst of extra energy they got from the increase in temperature. And I mean, they're still hitting, they're still exerting a force, but there's fewer of them now. So if we get to the point where the reduced mosh pit is still exerting the same force that they did at the start of the concert, I mean, that's great, but there's fewer of them now. And even if they do exactly what they were doing before, they can't maintain the same size of the mosh pit as they did before because there's just not as many particles anymore. So the rest of the audience is going to sort of crush in on them. And the trend just continues. The inside air pressure continues to get smaller and smaller and smaller. And that increases the rate at which the egg is pushed into the flask. And it's a pretty much a foregone conclusion at this point. Once you get that egg going into the flask, as long as you set things up right, it's pretty much a done deal. And the egg continues to drop as the temperature inside the flask continues to decrease. If we want to be technical about it, as the egg moves into the flask, it's actually compressing the air inside the flask and might actually be increasing the pressure a little bit. So sometimes you'll see the egg get kind of stopped halfway down because the pressure on the inside of the flask has built up enough to stop the egg from going down further. But hopefully it works out for you and the egg ends up the whole way in the bottom. And of course, in the example that I showed you, the egg did make it all the way down. And once the egg gets to the bottom, you might actually hear a little bit of a pop as the egg drops through the bottom as the pressure sort of normalizes. But once the top of the flask is open to the atmosphere, everything sort of normalizes out. And we have the same pressure inside and outside again. The circle of physics continues. So if we want to summarize the entire thing, we put a flame inside of a flask. The flame heats up the particles, causes them to move faster. Some of the particles, as a result, move out of the flask, leaving less dense air inside. There are fewer particles left inside the flask, but because they're moving faster, because of the associated increase in temperature, they're hitting harder, and they're able to maintain a balance of pressure between the inside and the outside. If the pressure on the inside of the flask ever gets higher than the atmospheric pressure, then some of the air just leaves because things always move to area of lower pressure. So when we cap the flask with the egg, the pressure on the inside is equal to the pressure on the outside. But as soon as we cap it, we put the fire out and the particles inside the flask begin to slow down. Remembering that there's fewer number of particles now, as they slow down, they can't provide as much oomph, they can't provide as much pressure on the egg from the inside of the flask as the air is exerting on the outside of the flask. So if we end up with a lower air pressure inside the flask, things always move to the lower pressure. So the egg is pushed into the flask by the higher air pressure on the outside. And there we go. The idea of there being a difference in pressure and there being a force that results from that is seen all over the place in physics. So if you continue your studies, this will definitely not be the last time that a difference in pressure causes something to move. And hopefully working from this example gives you a bit of a scaffold to build some of those other phenomenon on top of. And just a good lesson in general that if we take a careful look at the physics in play, we can sometimes clear up snap misconceptions about what we see happening. People look at it and they say, well, the egg's pulled into the flask. No, the egg's not pulled into the flask. The egg is pushed into the flask by atmospheric pressure from the outside, which honestly is kind of cooler than some magical mystical force just pulling the egg inside. Okay, thanks for watching this explanation. If you enjoy understanding how eggs end up in flasks, please consider liking the video. If you have any questions about my explanation, please leave them in the comments below. And to help the channel grow and learn about new demonstrations coming your way from Transparent Physics, click subscribe. Hey, thanks for watching to the end of this lesson. I know probably watching the egg go into the bottle is a little more exciting than the explanation, but it's also a lot cooler when you know why it's happening. So hopefully I've made the concept of pressure and eggs into bottles a little clearer for you on this lesson from Transparent Physics.